effectively and dangerously. It doesn't take very much to think about how dangerous a potential attack on freedom of speech that is. And of course, who is to define what a reasonable person of reasonable firmness is or extreme distress? Of course, that is first of all the social media companies and then the courts, but not by reason and not by reference to civil and criminal liability, by reference to no test whatsoever. It's a badly thought out act. It's not necessary. It's an attack on freedom of speech. And I'm afraid to say that making anonymous accounts impossible publicly on Twitter would also be an attack on freedom of speech. So I beg to oppose this.
Right, because we've got a little bit more time, I'm just going to go back to Mark quickly before I ask the panellists something. And just a right to respond to Francis. I mean, just this question of a cesspit and anonymity. I mean, surely it's also been the case that there's been all sorts of terrible, nasty gutter press ideas out, and that was often an argument for restricting speech because they say often terrible things. Some people would even argue even libel laws are a restriction of free speech. Is it the case that Francis poses the question, but who decides if you give big tech companies the decision to be able to monitor what they constitute as being abusive? How is that? Do you see that as being a problem in terms of creep, or do you still think that that's all very straightforward and clear?
Well, look, the truth is they already have that power now. When they took Donald Trump's Twitter account away, they did that in the US under US legislation. Yeah. So these companies already wield fantastic power. About 90% of the adults in the United Kingdom have a Facebook account. And the people who run these companies are extremely rich. And these companies are completely opposed to any kind of regulation. They want basically to be able to continue to do what they do, and they don't want any kind of curbs because it may cost them money. And it's very well to say theoretically they've got all these checks and balances. You try challenging them and see how long it takes for them actually to react. I mean, I challenged something on Twitter some weeks ago, and I've never even had the courtesy of a reply. So don't give me all this guff about they've got these great codes and you don't need any statute. There's no point trying to regulate these people voluntarily because they don't take any notice. The only way you will make the Zuckerbergs of this world play fair is if you compel them to do it by law, because we've been asking them to do it voluntarily for years, and they laugh at us. So actually, voluntary regulation in this sense does not work. Would that it did, but it doesn't. So I believe you're at the point now where you need to use the force of the law, because these companies are so big and powerful, nothing else in the real world actually works.
Okay, so I'm going to ask each of the panellists to respond.
Thank you, Alan. And Mark, I mean, the thing that I was thinking about, Mark, was that you are a politician who, which now feels like back in the midst of time, it was only very recently, during the Brexit debate, spoke so eloquently so many times about the importance of democracy. And I think people don't often think about democracy when they think about free speech. It's just free speech is this abstract thing that we sort of toss around, are you for it, are you against it? But the linking with free speech and a citizen's ability to express themselves, the idea that you began with, that we're not a despotic country, but that we are living in a country that respects citizens' ability to speak freely. How can you have such a solid view of democracy, or have had since 2016, and yet now be arguing for big companies and the state to have the power to remove the democratic right of people to converse online freely? Yes, sometimes in rather blue terms. I mean, that the thing about death threats and the way people speak online, and yes, Twitter can be a cesspit, but I mean, I'm from an Irish family, and the way we talk to each other sometimes is horrendous. I mean, is it common, if you want to insult someone, you say, may you die roaring. I mean, death threats get tossed around all the time. That's not to say that there's not a problem with Twitter, but you know, where is your belief in democracy when it comes to people's ability to speak on, especially on Twitter and Facebook, which have now, during the course of the pandemic, we've seen pretty much taken the place of the public square. And then that's where we talk politics. That, you know, more often than not now, isn't it, that rather than going to an MP's, you know, constituency surgery, you tweet them, and sometimes they tweet back. And therefore, Twitter and Facebook is the public square. And so your calls for Zuckerberg to, you know, to curtail Zuckerberg, really sound like to me that you're handing him the keys to our ability to decide what we do and don't say. I mean, how's that fair? How's that democratic?
Let me try and answer plainly. You said that I've attacked free speech. I absolutely have not. If somebody wants to go online and say, I don't think you're much cop as the Member of Parliament for Rayleigh and Wickford, if you're so thin-skinned that you can't put up with that, then you're in the wrong job as an MP. I'm not saying anybody can't go online and criticise me or the Prime Minister or any other politician. That's not my point. With respect, you completely misrepresented my position. No, you have. You said I'm against people being able to criticise and exercise free speech. I'm not. I'm in favour of free speech. I just want people to put their name to what they're saying. Because if they're going to challenge Mark Francois, if I'm challenged by Bill Bloggs, and I know who Bill Bloggs is, if I disagree with Bill Bloggs, I can go back and say, with respect, Mr. Bloggs, you're entitled to your opinion, but I disagree with you for the following reasons. How do you have a reasoned grown-up debate with Mickey Mouse or Donald Duck? You can't. So I'm not against free speech, I'm not against criticism. I just want people to have the moral courage to put their name to their opinions online, and then we can debate with them if we want. That is not, to try and say that that is curtailing free speech, is beyond daft.
Moral courage is a really interesting idea, and I think people should think about it and come back on it. One of the things people might have seen today is J.K. Rowling saying that she's going to continue talking out, even though she's getting lots of death threats. And the thing is, obviously, there's a difference between a death threat and then saying all sorts of things. But you know, you'll be interested to hear what you think about Ella's point. And if people really genuinely here in this audience do believe in free speech, not just in the things that you agree, not just that you're furious perhaps that some of the ideas you like are not out there, we're definitely going to come back to that. In the academy, we've seen some of these things happen consistently. People talk about cancel culture and things like that, but Professor Dennis Hayes has talked and written quite a lot about all of this, and I'm going to hand over to you for your question.
Will the mic go that far?
Yes. Yes, it will. I just think how illiberal this whole discussion has become. You know, and my test of this is John Stuart Mill. And if you read the second chapter of On Liberty, which is on the liberty of thought and discussion, he has a discussion about what he calls vituperative speech. That's the sort of thing that we've been talked about with Twitter. And what he says is behind, obviously be respectful, that's a good way to get yourself listened to, but the people who condemn vituperative speech are in some way or other defending power. It's always the powerful who want to restrict your speech, and they'll always say because it's ugly, it's nasty, and they want to restrict it. And I think you can see that already happening on Twitter and on Facebook. You say anything and you get banned and censored. And so they're one sort of power, but this is governmental power. So I think you should always be suspicious when somebody says these are scurrilous, horrible things. And you think, well, what are you going to do about it? Because we have the right to be scurrilous, we have the right to be horrible to one another. And that's what free speech is. I was going to say this in my talk, but two things about free speech. One, it should be free, right, unrestricted, that's what it means. And the other thing, it should be speech, it's not action. So free speech is really important. And I think if you go back to John Stuart Mill, I would recommend go back and read that second chapter on liberty and, and defend even vituperative speech.
So horrific, nasty speech, Mark.
Okay, let me ask you a very direct question. So do you support the right of that person who went online and said they wanted Nadine Dorries to burn to death in a car and to watch while the skin melted off her face? That is pretty vituperative. Do you support the right of that person to do that? No. This is an actual. It's all very no. Well, no, and this is my question back. You know, so it's all very well quoting political philosophers. Here's a real-world example, because the internet didn't exist, as far as I know, when John Stuart Mill was writing. Edmund Burke, there wasn't much email around in his day either. So please answer my genuine question. Do you support the right of that person to say they wanted to see a member of Parliament burned to death in a car? Yes or no?
I haven't stopped beating my mother either. I think the real issue...
That's silly.
Well, yeah, fine. The issue is, it's not an act that we're describing. It's not an act, it's speech, right? And you elide that distinction between speech and action, you know. If I say I'm going to thump Tamandra, that's one thing. If I thump Tamandra, that's a different thing, right? And I think you always say that it's somehow, if you're defending people's speech, you're defending their actions. It's completely different. And one thing that's happened in the contemporary period, if we elided the distinction between speech and action, so if you think that somebody's speech says something, it's as bad as acting, and it just isn't, right? So yes, free speech means it has to... Just a second. Free speech has to be free. So you're saying you would not have any sort of speech you dislike or you find horrible. That's fine. Be a censor. But I'm not being a censor, but I'm not defending the act. You know, if you go out and try to do that, then you should be stopped. That's act, right? It's not speech. You have to defend free speech. Unfortunately, you know, I'm a free speech absolutist, and that means you defend all speech. It doesn't mean you let it go. You know, attack it for the nasty, vicious, horrible statement it was, and that's how you respond to it. Just give you one judgment. There was a debate about this in America in the Supreme Court, and lawyers will know this, and Whitney v. Houston in 1927, where people were just arguing that you should overthrow the state, right? And Justice Brandeis made this really good point. No matter how evil speech is, the response is more speech, not enforced silence.
I think we're going to come to Tamandra in a second, but it does make me think, Mark, when you say this, that there are many calls out in society today saying that is really offensive and disgusting and reprehensible and abhorrent, and you've offended me. Today, apparently, saying that you're triggered is triggering, so there was an argument to ban that. And it sounds trivial, because obviously you say, well, we all know what something is really disgusting and contemptuous is, but the question is, who's deciding and judging? And is it, once you say this bit is like that, then you say it opens the door to say everything's that? We either have it or we don't, I suppose is the question.
Well, forgive me, but I respectfully disagree. Here's the essence of my argument. If people wish to be vile online, I mean, I'd rather they weren't. But if people wish to be vile online to other people who very often they've never met, they just don't like what they represent, they should have the guts to put their name to it. I don't think that represents an oppressive state. I really don't. You know, for centuries, if you've written a letter to the Times newspaper, you've had to put your name on it. They tend these days less and less to print letters that just say name and address supplied. So, in a sense, we've had this system for centuries. I genuinely, I mean, I sense the mood of the hall, but I genuinely don't think I'm saying anything incredibly radical here. And, you know, it looks like I'm outnumbered 3 or 4 to 1, but we had a bit of that in Brexit and we did all right. At the end of the day, we won. So I'll stand my ground if that's all right, or sit my ground here. But I really don't think, I mean, this is being made out to be some incredibly repressive move. I don't think it is. You want repression? Okay, you know, if you're a Uyghur, you're locked up in a camp in China for having the temerity to believe in God. Look at this instance of this female tennis player who criticised a senior official of the Chinese Communist Party and hasn't been seen since. That's oppression. That's a really dangerous state. What's that got to do with saying if you want to go online and say some politicians are twit, or be really rude about their loved one, or someone else, you've got to put your name on it. Trying to conflate the two, I'm terribly sorry, is absolutely daft.
All right, I'm going to go to Tamandra, but Ella has asked us to say something quickly.
Just a
historical check here, which is that it's starting to feel like anonymity online is like just been invented yesterday, and that people just started saying things with fake names yesterday to piss off politicians. I mean, the radical pamphleteering tradition in Britain was about, often with people who were really challenging state power, and if they got caught were under pain of having their ears cut off or their legs cut off or being strung up, hung, drawn and quartered, would publish those pamphlets anonymously with messages spread around citizens hidden in pockets to challenge the ruling class of that day. I mean, and it strikes me it's not impossible that it's not just people who are saying nasty things about Nadine Dorries or your loved ones online, but also people who might be using anonymity to challenge state power. And it doesn't surprise me that Tory politicians made a little bit itchy by that.
Here we go. Now we get to the heart of it. And here we go.
What is it?
Yeah.
Okay, I think there's lots of broader points to be made, and I would particularly like to talk more about the online harms bill or online safety bill or whatever they're calling it at the moment, as Francis raised, but I will save that for a bit later. I want to come back really specifically to the question of online anonymity, because I completely get where Mark is coming from, both that when something appalling happens to somebody you like and respect, there is the urge to try and do something. There's always the urge to try and make sure it can never happen again. So I understand that instinct. And I also understand the instinct that the way to balance having freedom of speech and trying to make the internet a place of real, constructive, democratic debate and not of childish shouting and horrible abuse, is to say, well, you can say what you like, but you have to stand up and say it in your real name. And I get where that's coming from. I mean, the stuff I do online is all in my own name, and I'm really, really easy to Google. So I stand up. But on the other hand, I'm not employed by anybody. I'm a freelancer. Nobody can rob me out of my job by emailing my employer, right? I live next door to some neighbours with really big dogs, and I've befriended both dogs and neighbours, so in the unlikely event someone cared enough to photograph themselves on my doorstep, they'd get pretty short shrift. And in my previous life, I used to host comedy clubs, so nothing that some guy types on the internet on his mum's sofa is going to make me cry, right? If you're not sitting in the front row and shouting it at me drunkenly, I simply don't care. So, I'm in quite a lucky position from all those points of view. The thing about internet anonymity is it feels like that will put everyone on a level playing field and we can all say what we really think and let's get it out there. But that's not how it works. I was really struck by what you said right at the beginning, Mark, where you said, in other countries you criticise governments and you disappear. We don't have that. We mustn't take living in a free country for granted. But the thing is, the internet is not a national thing. The internet is international. So many people have good reason for being anonymous. Even if they don't fear what will happen to them politically in this country, they may fear what will happen somewhere else. There's no guarantee that the government in this country will always respect democracy. There's a very famous and chilling example in the Netherlands before the Second World War, where with the best of intentions, they took a census of the religion of the people in the country so they could make sure that everybody had somewhere to worship their God in the way that they saw fit. And when the Nazis took over the Netherlands, they had ready-made records of all the Jewish people, and we know what use they made of that. And finally, you don't have to go that far to find people having real consequences for not being anonymous online. The benefits of anonymity online accrue mainly to the people who would be the victims. When you say you shouldn't be able to say what you want without consequences, this is the argument that's constantly used against people like J.K. Rowling, when people turn up on her doorstep and photograph themselves with her address visible and tweet that out so that she gets still more death threats and still more worries about people turning up. People who find that their employers are contacted by people who don't like what they have to say and try and get them run out of their job. For some people, anonymity is the principle on which their free speech is based. I know I've been going rather a long time. I just want to finish with one thing. When I was writing my book about data, I went to Oakland in San Francisco Bay, where they have a really active privacy campaign, which has now become a privacy commission, and the citizens get to scrutinise the technology that scrutinises them. It's an absolute model of democratic control. And the guy who's now the chair of that commission walked me around Oakland and spoke to me about the history of this campaign. And he said, well, the council wanted to bring in a system that would use facial recognition, automatic number plate recognition, and would track things going on in Oakland. And we had to point out to them that this infringes our First Amendment rights to freedom of speech and association. Because if we know that we're going to be tracked when we go to an abortion clinic or when we go to a meeting, then we don't have freedom of speech and association, because there may be consequences on our exercising those freedoms. And for that reason, I see what you're trying to do here, but online anonymity is not the way to do it.
I'm going to ask Mark to respond, but we're going to bring out I'm going to ask for 3 questions from the audience, but you're going to have to come up and see Leslie. She's going to hold the mic, because then you're going to ask, he's going to respond, and then we're going to come back to the panellists to make their introductions. I have a question, Mark, as well, just relating to this. I mean, it does strike me that in the last 20 months there have been takedowns on the internet. There's been shielding, discussion of certain keywords, vaccination, children. Ofcom has got a set of rules and regulations for broadcasters. I'm not sure it's the same kind of debate that was had around Brexit, for instance, where you could have someone who's pro-Brexit and someone who's Remain. We don't tend to have seen a similar discussion in that context. And there's been a lot of people who have been taken down consistently. You might disagree with their ideas, or I might disagree with their ideas, but I think surely we need to be able to hear them and discuss them and shine the light of them. But we've already got a situation where big tech is making decisions both through algorithms and interactions. And to what extent do you think that this might amplify it or not is a question I've got. But then if the 3 of you can come up and so we know where you're going to go. Now come up and you're going to stand next to Leslie, and I'm going to go to Mark and then the questions. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. I thought it was 3 people. Yeah, well, let me put it like this. I think I've laid out my case, and you either agree with me or you don't. And I sense that I do not have a majority in the hall tonight. But nevertheless, I put my case before you. Now, Winston Churchill once described parliamentary democracy as the worst possible system of government, apart from all the others. And when this bill comes before Parliament in the new year, I don't think we've got the date yet, but probably second reading sometime in January or February, we will do what we are supposed to do. We will debate it. And a number of options and amendments will be put forward to that legislation. So I will argue the case for removing anonymity. I think I'll get some support from some of my colleagues, and I'll be opposed by others. Some, I think that anonymity is not the answer, but they're in favour of stronger verification. So in other words, you can still be anonymous, but if you do something really truly vile or criminal, it's easier to track down who you are. Some others want to make the big social media companies much more akin to publishers, so that if they publish something which is illegal or incredibly vile, then people could take action against them in the way that they could against the newspaper. So Parliament will debate these different issues and the pluses and minuses of various courses of action, which in a way perhaps we have done this evening. One of our fellow panellists has called himself an absolutist for free speech. I'm sure there'll be some people in the House of Commons who take that view. There's a spread of opinion in the Commons, by the way, not just based on people's party political affiliation. On these sorts of things, you'll find this cut right across party lines in the way that some other emotive issues do. And so these different options will be put before the House of Commons, they'll be debated, and in the end we'll decide them democratically by voting. That is how you make law. So I just make the point that I'm advocating one argument this evening, and at least I've turned up and faced in front of an audience which I knew might not agree with me.
Good idea.
But nevertheless, on a slightly difficult day, I've turned up. So if you don't mind me saying, so there's an example of free speech. and others in the Commons will put their points of view, will debate it democratically, and then we'll come to a decision and we'll make some law. It's called democracy. It's the least worst system of government apart from all the others. Thank you very much.
Leslie's going to hold the mic, you've got to hold it, Leslie, and you've got to go really close. And we're going to go one after the other in succession.
Okay, I just wanted to make the point that these big companies, these big tech companies, can remove content very, very quickly when they want to. When they want to, and I think we're just letting them off the hook here and transferring the onus onto the public. But you didn't respond to Francis's point about whistleblowers being won't be able to do their whistleblowing under these circumstances. And we as a society, we've already got the media not holding government or other entities to account. We as a society will be much poorer without whistleblowers being able to whistleblow in anonymity.
Thank you. Very close.
Hello. Quick comment for everyone to
Leslie's
stop.
holding it.
Oh, sorry.
It's
the regs.
Yeah.
Okay. First thing to say is we can replace these platforms now. You don't need to be on them. What they do is socially pretty useless. The technology they're using, particularly for Facebook and Twitter, is actually very outdated. You can replace them completely using open source free tools that you can find on the internet, and I think that the more people doing that, the better, basically, because the way that we take their power away is by stop giving them our attention, essentially. So there's a lot of talk about big tech. I think that our job is to try and undermine them as much as possible. The question is, given for the whole of this year pretty much, I mean, I've got a tweet that I saw in January with Nadine Zahawi, the then vaccine minister, saying that the COVID passport doesn't exist. I'm going to paraphrase it. It will never be rolled out, and it's not something that we're considering. Why now should we believe anything that the government has to say about its plans for the digital infrastructure that's being built? Particularly when we look at how things are playing out at the moment in places like Australia, where I've seen evidence of people being visited by the police for attending a protest or saying something that was anti-government, shall we say, a few months before. Why would we trust you and the control apparatus in this country, the police and the intelligence agencies, with this kind of power?
Hi, my name's Nico MacDonald. I wrote an article in about 2009 arguing that people should not be anonymous online, but should actually take responsibility for their words. Wired, The Well, one of the early online networks the previous people would have heard of, had a phrase which was, you own your own words. If you say something, you've got to stand by them. And I argued that in an age when people commented at the end of newspaper articles effectively anonymously, they should post stuff in their own space. I'll use an expression that's a bit coarse, shit on your own doorstep, and if you do that, people will see you for what you are. I argue that actually people have started to do that. They have their own words in their own space, which is Twitter, Facebook, Gab, and so on. But the reality is people still act pretty disgracefully, even with their name next to something. So I agree very much with Dennis that if people, anonymity is not, removing it is not going to solve this. And if people actually, people need to be argued with. If someone is being obnoxious online, if they're being immoral in the way in which they're behaving to someone else, take them on. That's our responsibility as radicals, as free speech advocates and so on. And my challenge to Mark, the other thing is, if someone's a bot, effectively, with no followers and an anonymous account, who gives a fuck what they say? Sorry. Who cares what they say? What was said about Nadine Norris is disgusting. If I knew that person or had any association with them, I'd say, take that down. You shouldn't treat another human being, particularly a representative of ours, like that. But if they've got 5 followers and no name, they have no influence. If they have no influence, who cares? Just ignore them. If they have influence, then we need to engage with them and we need to take them on. And there are bad ideas out there. Sometimes they get influence. And we argue with them, and that's how we make progress. But just to finish, my concern is about the freedom for me to hear ideas that I want to hear and evaluate. And it's not about freedom of speech, it's about me respecting myself, that I can hear something and I can evaluate it and judge it, and I can decide whether I agree with it, and I can then advocate it. So I want to know, for Mark particularly, and I do respect him very much for being here, do you trust yourself, Mark, to hear any idea and not turn into a terrorist, a sociopath or whatever?
Sorry?
It's about, do you believe people have the right to hear ideas, that they can be trusted to hear ideas? Because if we do you trust yourself to hear ideas? Do you trust me? If you don't trust people to hear ideas and evaluate them and come away a more informed, a better politically educated person, then essentially you don't trust the electorate.
Thank you. Thanks, Sharon.
Can I take those in reverse order? During the whole Brexit, what I call the battle for Brexit, I spent 3 years fighting the British establishment day in, day out. So if the suggestion is I'm someone that can't deal with ideas, you weren't listening.
Do you trust yourself?
Well, I hope so, because, I thought what I believed to be the right case, we left the European Union, not just because of me, but I was vilified day in, day out for my belief. And it was mainly the establishment of Project Fear who were arguing the other side of the case. So as someone who spent 3 years fighting Project Fear, I hope I do. COVID passports, I'm one of the small minority of Tory MPs who voted against COVID passports. I've been called many things in the last few years, but I've never been called a sort of whip's off his arse kisser by anybody. Least of all, by the way, by them. So now on the whistleblowing point, I've heard this argument a number of times. I don't think that what I'm proposing would end all whistleblowing. I still think that if people, let's say they find out that there was some corruption in some element of the NHS, for instance, I don't believe that that would stop them taking it to the authorities. I don't believe that they have to go online as Mickey Mouse in order to get someone to take that seriously. I understand the whistleblowing argument, but if you pardon the pun, I think it is overblown, and it's sometimes used by some people, I'm not saying you, sir, but it's sometimes used by some people who don't want any regulation of the internet, some people who perhaps earn more money than you and I do, and so they fall back on the whistleblowing excuse in order to try and make sure that they can't be regulated. So, and I'm not saying this applies to you for the avoidance of doubt, but I think some people sometimes use that argument, if you like, as cover or an excuse for why they don't want to be regulated at all under any circumstances. So I hope those are 3 fairly direct answers to those 3 questions. Shock horror headline, hold the front page, MP answers question. Thanks very much.
I'm going to go across this way, you can respond to the question.
Just 2 quick points. Whistleblowing, well, obviously some people might clothe themselves in anonymity when they don't need it, but many others will not, and they need it. And as was said to my left earlier, many of these people have, well, no, not really as it were in any other way, but many of these people either are representing ideas which are being said in this country elsewhere, where they do live under tyranny, and we can question the extent to which we are truly a free and liberal democratic country in the last 20 months, frankly, in this country as well. And you don't have to be a genocidal country like China to tear up human rights and fundamental liberties and fundamental principles of democracy, because our government's done it in this country too. So let's not forget that. And let's not use the example of a terrible system like China, which of course is the origin of lockdowns and the origin of the destruction of our fundamental rights and democracy over the last 20 years. Let's not use that terrible example as an example that it's okay if you just don't do that. Obviously, there are many people who need anonymity, and the answer is, of course, they're worse. Of course, they're worse, but that doesn't mean we need to emulate them. Obviously, there are people who do need anonymity, and taking it to the authorities is obviously not sufficient when they're complaining about those authorities. And secondly, just on vituperative speech, I'm not an absolutist, because I recognise that there are criminal laws on speech, including on threats to kill, including on malicious communications, which are there already. So let's just enforce the laws that we've got. And finally, just the point about verification, that is a sensible proposal. Make people verify who they are, but not force them in all circumstances to say who they are to everyone else.
Well, sorry.
Hold on. We're going to go back.
Well, no, hang on.
Yeah.
Verification is one of the options that Parliament will.
Yeah, it's a good option.
Yeah.
Understand what I'm saying?
One of the things I just wanted to elaborate on, because I don't think it got enough of a hearing, was Nico's point about trust. Because I mean, Mark, several times you used the Churchill quote about democracy being the best, worst, or whatever. Those of us who were part of the Brexit movement, who perhaps took a more radical stance, understood that and fought for the idea that democracy wasn't just the best of a bad bunch, or the thing that has kind of limped along over the last 20, 30 years and has had a bit of a revival around Brexit, but that the EU referendum vote, as passionate as I was about it in the same way you were, but that it encompassed this idea that your average Joe and Jane had as much right to have a say in politics as the colleagues that you sit next to in the House of Commons, or indeed those in the House of Lords, from the Queen down to the street sweeper. And within that idea of radical democracy and the importance of democracy was the idea that we are able to, the trust that Nika was talking about, that we're able to handle ideas, that we're able to think about politics, that we're able to do politics as much as lawmakers and as much as politicians. So actually democracy is not the best word, it is the best. And in fact you could argue that it hasn't yet been fully realised in the way in which we still have politicians arguing that under certain circumstances the rabid public who like to, death threat online and be really nasty to each other need to have curtailments. I think you have to really, you've thrown around the word absolutist. I mean, in your opening speech, you talked about free speech and the importance of it, and the but came along. It took a while to come along, but it did come along. Not you hear politicians and commentators and lots of people who make up the influential and the powerful in this country using free speech as a bit of a shield. They say, yes, I'm really, really for it, yes, but. And the reason why that but is important, because it is always a check on the idea of democracy. It's a check on saying, well, not those people, well, actually not in those circumstances. And as Francis has pointed out, that's the way in which the creep of censorship happens, because today it's the person that you don't like being censored, and so who cares about that? They're pretty nasty. Tomorrow, as we've seen throughout the experience of the pandemic and discussions around everything from coronavirus to lockdowns, it will be your opinion that is not to someone else's liking. And so you have to take a relatively absolutist position, otherwise you just end up that creep inching further and further.
So we're coming to a break, Andrew. And so I'm going to give Mark an opportunity to say so. I just want to say that it takes courage and bravery to come along, particularly on these 2 days, but at any time. And I really respect very much courage to argue, and it wasn't the intent. We wanted to have a robust debate, we've done it, and Mark's been very brave, and I would really like to thank you very much for coming and doing that and having this for the audience. So before I give you a chance. And now a couple of reflections. We've got a car coming for you.
You're very kind. Look, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. I did say up front, to be honest, that I had to go at 8. It wasn't that I was going at 8:30. It's got a bit hot in the kitchen and I'm scarpering for the exit. But I was up front about it. We've had a debate. I sense that the mood of the hall is on one. I kind of picked up on that. But nevertheless, I've come here this evening to put forward a point of view. If you like, to try and make the case for one of the options that will be put forward in Parliament. You've heard an argument, I think, for verification. In effect, you've heard an argument for no further control of any type. You've heard a number of different options put before you this evening, and then it's our job to try and debate those in the House of Commons and hopefully come up with the right solution. So I do still believe that we live in a free country, and I do believe that we're going to carry on doing that, whatever happens on the online safety bill. But thank you for your attention, thank you for your comments and for your feedback. I'll now leave you in the hands of these very capable people for the next half an hour. And I'm just going to go and do some details about something that's quite important to me. So thank you for your time, and I hope you all have a safe and pleasant journey home. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. So now I'm going to go in reverse order. I'm going to ask the panellists to do their kind of overview. Obviously, they've had some questions, and then we're going to come back to the audience, and we're going to go over, maybe we might go over a little bit of time, so you all get a few more questions in. So Mandra, I'm going to start with you.
Right. I thought there was some very good, interesting points raised earlier. I am, partly in light of the very good speakers on my right, so to speak, I am going to stick quite closely to, if you like, the technical issues, because that's kind of my beat, that's what I know. I think, in a sense, I was being really specific about online anonymity and why it doesn't do the thing that people wanted to do, which is make the internet a nicer, more civil place and raise public debate to the level I think most of us would like it to be at. Even given the fact that robust speech is also speech and not action, which I think we sometimes forget that reading horrible words on the internet is not the same as actions, and it's not even the same as someone coming in your face and saying something, because when somebody is typing something online, they often...
That's when we go over to you. But just on one last point, that I wrote a statement of academic freedom way back in 2006 with Roy Harris at Oxford University. And the original statement of academic freedom in the Education Reform Act 1988 as academics have freedom within the law. And Roy made the point, and fixed up some of the things that Thomas said, we took it off. So we said academics have freedom, not within the law. Because the law restricts too much. And a lot of the critics of the online there, read a few of them, say, we already have these laws. This will restrict our freedoms within the law. But I don't want freedom within the law. Free speech is not equivalent to free speech within the law. Free speech must be able to criticise laws and go beyond laws. So I think, if you believe in free speech, you just don't accept any restrictions on it at all.
I'll be quick because I spent a long time having a pop at Mark, not because just for a cheap reason, but it's interesting that a politician goes on about the importance of having debates in Parliament, which obviously is part of democracy. But when members of the public get to sit on a panel with him, I'm going to take all my opportunities to possibly chasten him to realise that within the discussion that Mark and other politicians will be having about free speech online, there will be, I guarantee you, no one within that chamber arguing for free speech with no restrictions, as myself, Dennis, Samantha and Francis have talked about it. There might be some people who think you can tinker a bit there, you can tinker a bit there, a few rules here, swap them for there. No one is in Parliament at the moment believes in a principle of free speech with no restrictions, in the same way that very, very few people in Parliament, and this is why I was so disappointed with Mark, understood the concept of democracy in relation to the Brexit debate was always with some kind of check and balance. And also, we've talked a lot about this proposition of David's Law, but we're talking in a context at the moment in which the Conservative government, backed up by a very silent Labour government that is failing to be in opposition, is currently moving through a series of changes in law which are going to be disastrous for freedom of expression in various ways. You have the online harms bill, you have the police and crime sentences, the one with a big long name, that's cracking down on the freedom of protest under ridiculous things like noise restrictions. Priti Patel's just having a whale of a time in Parliament at the moment, cracking down on freedoms left, right and centre. In discussions about how we talk about climate change, the government is being incredibly censorious as to not allowing any discussion. Mention the word coal and you're like some kind of evil witch. In discussions around, that in discussions, there are currently lots of female MPs from the Labour and the Conservative bench, backed up by some guys, who want to now bring in a misogyny law, which will, anyone try to define misogyny at the moment, it means far broader terms than simply hatred towards women. It just means saying anything unpleasant. There's that. Try talking about gender at the moment, inside or outside the House of the Parliament. So see what I'm saying? In various ways, in laws and in discussion, the health of democracy and the health of free speech is a very low ebb. I think that's the thing I just really want to pick up on, is that, and I've had a pop at Mark and at politicians, and maybe now I want to have a pop at you guys, because the thing that I think is different from, throughout history we have had the elites wanting to clamp down on various guises, wanting to clamp down on free expression. So when the printing press first came out, it wasn't just that, now everyone's allowed to have newspapers, brilliant. There was a a huge panic within the royalty, within politicians, are saying that this is a terrible thing. We're going to have people being able to read and able to criticise us. In the beginning of state education, the concept of mass education was abhorrent, because the idea that the working classes would be able to read literature and think of a different world other than the misery of their working life was a terror. It was a horror for the ruling classes. The right to vote for women and working class people was, on and on and on. And so it is with social media. But the idea that people will have unbridled access to not just tweet at their politicians, but, God forbid, at each other across borders and countries, that's a terrifying thing. The thing that's different today, that's different from all throughout those ages, is that rather than it just being snobby elites who want to clamp down on freedoms and restrict it and set the terms of the debate, I think that we now are, more often than not, normal people, are using and weaponising the idea of offence far more than we ever had. So the idea that Tamandra talked about of harm, we've got an incredibly thin-skinned about understanding what it means to try and legislate around offence. I mean, many of us who are against vaccine passports and, have criticised the government's approach to lockdown at all costs throughout the pandemic, have been enraged by the fact that we haven't been allowed to have open discussion online, that everybody in the press and the media seems to want one thing, and the level of censorship. But then I see just this week, one of the presenters on GB News mentioned the fact that they're in favour of vaccine mandates. And suddenly all of our crowd of presumably freedom-loving people come out and say, call Ofcom, what's this? This person shouldn't be allowed to say this. This is harmful, this is terrible. I mean, I'm an avidly pro-choice person who campaigns for abortion rights. We are supposed to be on the freedom side. Many of my colleagues and fellow activists spend most of their time trying to argue that the anti-choice side should be silenced on campus or elsewhere. We've got a very skewed idea of freedom. And we've weaponised the idea of offence. We've become pathetic, actually, I think, in the 21st century, in ways that our colleagues of old, the radical pamphleteers who risked getting their ears and nose cut off, weren't. They understood what it meant to be offensive and the reason why it was important to defend the idea of being offensive. I think too often now we are giving up the mantle of fighting for free speech, and it's not just that politicians in an authoritarian state are clamping down, but that we have exited the battlefield. I think we need to try and regain that fight.
It's hard to you guys now, but when I was growing up, quite a long time ago now, but people used to say, well, sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me. And they said, well, if he told you to put your hand in a fire, would you put your hand in a fire? And they said we're very simple, we've all heard it, but it seems today that those questions are all the more poignant again, right? So if you think about way back in 1977 when the ACLU, who were advocating around free speech for everyone, they actually represented the right for Nazis in America to protest and to demonstrate, and they won that. It was a very landmark case. But often I hear from people that if people say racist things or nasty things, they should be shut up because they're really offensive. Now, I find many things offensive, but I would have thought that the way to deal with those things is to have belief in the ability to convince some of your ideas or not, but to shine light on bad ideas and try and bring people over to that. I'm not sure if you all agree, right? Also, to Ella's last point, there's a lot of people called me about that GB piece. And is it the case that you all really agree with the idea that we should have unfettered free speech? And some of you may well agree with Mark and say that it's just, it's cowardice and it's outrageous, and you have to You know, you should not have anonymity. I'm going to take a round of questions and points. Come up to Leslie, please. Can we make it quite quick? Because I want to come up with a few of them, come back to the panel and come back again to you. Quick ones.
Yeah, thanks to the panellists. And Mark Francis, is obviously doing a great thing. Looking after David Ader's funeral. But yeah, ladies and gents, you talk about free speech, you talk about death threats. I will say that speech that enters in the realm of a threat upon someone's life or safety cannot be considered free speech. And I do not agree with that. I think it's cowardly and immoral to make such statements. I understand a challenge. You know, if you want to challenge someone to a battle, hey, I'm going to challenge the Queen. Meet me at 5 p.m. in that battlefield. That's how it used to be. That's how it should be. You know, if you do want to attack somebody, you want to have a fight, arrange a boxing match, make it happen. I don't think that should be considered a good thing.
Okay, thank you. Next one, let's get up next to Leslie. We'll just bring her around. Quite quick ones, and then we'll come back.
Well, I just wanted to say that it just seemed tonight that no one was really in touch with what it's like to be silenced on social media. And that's what a lot of us are experiencing at the moment, but anonymous or not. And I always used my own name from the beginning. I'm so naive, I had no idea what was going to come from me. Maybe I wouldn't have done, but I always have. Everyone knows it's me. And a friend of mine who actually, through social media, some time ago, had the police at her door, had a terrible time, nearly committed suicide. She hasn't had it recently, but she told me today that she's just been banned for 3 days for calling someone bonkers. Literally. Now, I'm just coming towards the end of my latest 30-day ban. They started on me back in February, which is when I'd actually just come out of hospital where I had COVID. Now, I've been very outspoken from the beginning about what I saw as horrors coming down the road because of the way this was all being used. But I had it, and very quickly, and it was my lifeline to the world, and suddenly I was being closed down, and people who were saying to me that they were glad I was in hospital with COVID because I deserved it, and they actually wished I was dead, never were silenced. And then I would say something tiny to them like, well, that's not very nice. And then suddenly I was like on a ban for saying something nasty to someone who wished me dead. This is what's going on at the moment. I used to speak about Israel-Palestine. I never got shut down on that, which is now very contentious. I never got closed down on social media. But on this particular one, I and many others like Fiona, a lot of us, who say nothing that... In fact, I've been closed down sometimes for quoting a Nobel Prize winner. And they tell me I shouldn't do that. What the hell is going on?
Thank you.
Question for the lady at the end. Are you ever really anonymous online because you can always be tracked to your IP address? And with the growth of artificial intelligence and supercomputers, doesn't that mean that any keystroke that we make, now we've been outed, we're not anonymous, they can come and track us, they can target advertising. If we say something is homophobic, for instance, not only now can the Facebook trolls come after us, but we can be doxxed as well at our house.
Thank you. 2 more and then we're going to come back.
Just a quick question. Wouldn't it be advisable that we do something on social media, for example, people who do good argument, give better arguments, get extra points and you get pushed a little bit more? Something like that would be far more. People who say nasty things, get pushed down a little bit. The other thing we're missing today is the question of whether our children, we're all adults here, where are the kids? You want the kids at school with their teachers to be told, hey, we're going to have a debate, you're going to opposite the exact opposite of what you believe in. Congratulations, that's your point. Yeah. That's what I do at university. I take my kid, I say, what is it you believe in? Fine, you're arguing the other side. Congratulations, welcome to the adult world. We're not doing that with our children. We're the wrong people. We need to get to our kids and teach them how to have conversations, don't we?
Yes.
A lot of the conversation tonight is focused on whether it would be right or not right for MPs to go and pass these censorship bills into acts. But shouldn't the question be whether they have the right to go and do that? Don't we have fundamental inalienable rights? Really, who are these fascists on green benches? People put in there by a defunct electoral system? We know the...
And they say, look at this racist, sexist or offensive scum.
And then it gets 1 million retweets, and the person who nobody knew who they were suddenly is famous, and maybe even in the newspapers the next day. And you have the decision within yourself and the power within yourself to decide how you're going to react to things. That's part of free speech, is how you react to things. Do you decide to interact or do you not? I mean, and you really, defending that power of people is what is about having trust in a sensible populace is really about. I get lots of death threats, but one of the death threats I remember getting to the spiked office, so if someone really took the trouble to write me one, I was far more upset about the fact that he called me Juggies than I was about him saying he's going to kill me. I mean, because human beings are weird, right? We're subjective. Things that we find offensive one day, we might not find offensive the next day. And the question really is, if we're talking about how to, just the last point, Alan, how to create a better social sphere of interaction, the best antidote or antiseptic, whatever that phrase is sunlight. And it strikes me that in a period in which of 18, 19 months now, social isolation that we've had, one of the things that we need to not do is stop people talking to each other. So in the context of a toxic atmosphere, in which far too many of us have not been to the pub enough, and indeed not talked to each other enough, and not been face to face, bringing in more restrictions on speech right now, do you really think that's a good thing?
Two things have changed. When I used to defend free speech, I thought I was quite safe. Don't say anything provocative, just defend free speech. But now that's become the worst crime of all. The idea that those things are beyond debate is a new term. It's the first time I've ever known it. It's like you're not allowed to discuss things. Discuss it, even arguing for discussion is like to get you censored. And somebody said, experience. I've spent half my life defending people who threaten with the sack for saying casual things. It often happens, and it's not just totalitarian things happen here. Say something people don't like, even in this debate, somebody will write to your employer, say this person should be fired. That's the sort of climate we live in. But just to put it in a more philosophical context, and Ella's point is right about the offence, but we live in what I would call a therapeutic culture, where safetyism, the phrase is, which is defined as being over-emotional about every issue. You must be emotionally safe in every circumstance. That is what people play on, and ordinary people play on that to get their way. Why do we listen? Every time you put the TV or radio on, there's somebody crying about something that's happened. And you could think, well, I'm being cruel about tragic victims. But the really important thing to understand is when you present yourself as a victim, if you are a victim, you have real moral authority. It doesn't make you weak. It's not the snowflake student. It actually gives you the right to be unquestionably true. But your speech is inviolable, and you are right because you're a victim. And that's the card that lots of people play all the time. And that's what makes it really difficult to stand up to. Because we hear all these said, what if somebody makes you death threats? What if somebody says this about your mother? What if somebody says this? Everybody's going to be really hurt. And if you challenge it, you sound like a monster. You always get these things. You're willing to let people have death threats. Oh, no, we're going to attack them for saying that. But, don't play the victim. Because you're not actually a victim. You're playing a powerful card. And governments, institutions, from the police service to teachers, everybody plays the victim. And that's because it makes you powerful. You really have to understand that.
Okay, I'll try and be concise. I love the idea about giving points for good arguing online. I really love that idea. And I'm just going to plug, I made a couple of radio series, in fact, for Radio 4 about arguing well. And if you find my website, which is clearly really, really easy to Google because it's my name, you can find links to those, and there are various ways you can listen to them and use them. So somebody asked me directly about, are we ever truly anonymous online? And that's a really good point, actually. It's very hard to be truly, completely anonymous online to the tech companies, basically. There is a constant race to keep track of who we are and what we're interested in so that they can sell us stuff, essentially. And I was writing about this recently, and it's a bit of an arms race between some governments saying, no, you can't just track people and profile them all the time, you're infringing their privacy, and the companies go, oh, all right, okay, we won't do that anymore. What we'll do is we'll have this we'll have this thing that can identify your browser. So it's not identifying you, you're completely anonymous, but we know what your browser is and that you're a person using this browser, and then we can track everything you do in this browser and know who you are and probably your IP address. So you're right, I mean, in practice, if you were doing something online, if you were, for example, plotting an act of terrorism, and the authorities really, really wanted to know who you were, they would go to the tech companies and they could find out who you were. It's very, very difficult to be truly, completely, impenetrably anonymous online. And to be honest, in the course of writing about things, I have had conversations with people with security clearance, let's just put it that way, and they often say, look, you know, we don't really care about this anonymisation, we don't care about this, that and the other. If we really, really want to know who somebody is and what they're doing, we have ways of doing that. You don't have to sweepingly take away everybody's rights to do that. Whether that should make you more worried or less worried, I don't know, but that's the world we're in.
We're going to come out for 3 more. If you've got any more questions or points, if you don't, okay, great, and then we're going to come back to yours. Can I ask you, if you do want to speak, what are your thoughts on this trusting everyone? I'm really interested to hear what you really think.
I was just going to say, you know, with free speech and online dissemination of information and things, the problem now is it's not that there's no free speech. It's more a case of the free speech that's allowed is limited, and you know, whether it's through algorithms or whether it's through lack of reach or whatever it is, and it's agenda driven, and that's the problem. You're talking about the GB News person saying about vaccine mandates or passports or whatever, agreeing with that, but the point is it's agenda driven. So when that's what's happening in the free speech, it's hard to kind of curtail that in any way. Another argument.
Yeah, come forward. If there's any more, come forward, great. Yes.
Thanks. Generally, I agree with the Queen's Charter. Try to debate this. So generally I agree, but a question that I've struggled to respond to is when
had a year ago, and that therefore means that we do need to allow people to speak online under anonymity. Do you feel differently now than you did a year ago?
1 minute now to sum up. I know it's very difficult, but we're going to carry on afterwards informally. Speaking is stay for drinks and continue, but you've got a 1 minute each, starting with you, Francis.
My general take on this is that we have laws, that they are important. I do think that it's appropriate to stop, for example, incitement to commit violence and so on that can, as was said by one of the speakers, cause real violence. But we have those laws already. My view is that this last year, 2 years almost, has revealed how important social media can be and is to spread debate. And what we need is to prevent social media companies from censoring debate, something I called for in July in my free speech report. That's what we need, not further protection against, further prevention of freedom of speech, which is what the Online Safety Bill will represent and will be.
Great.
The BBC's not all that bad. Samantha gets on it a lot of the time. I get to spout my crap on it sometimes. And I think that the panic about agenda-driven stuff, or perhaps not panic is an unpleasant word to use, the concern about agenda-driven and misinformation and all this kind of stuff, I think often steps into the danger of echoing the kind of real moral panic about fake news that we get from so many of our high-profile mainstream media commentators and politicians. It works both ways, right? Each side is shouting, no, you're biased, no, you're biased, no, you're lying to us, no, you're lying to us. And that's really where a principled idea of free speech has to come into play, which says, yes, Channel 4 News and The Guardian and the BBC or whoever has a right to put out and I actually don't mind, that's one of the good things about GB News is I don't mind people revealing their opinion. I don't mind it when media commentators and newspaper articles reveal their bias, because I'm able to, and all of us in this room are able to see it for what it is, to think about it, to assess it, and to judge it. Just on the last point, Alan, is that words are powerful. To the lady's question about how we deal with words turning into actions. And I'm a journalist. My world is words. I'm a literature lover. I read words that make me fall on the ground crying. That, you know, Tamandra does comedy. She uses words to make people laugh. Words can incite to action. They cause revolution. They have made history. We know that. And that's the sacred fact of how powerful words are, is why we can't afford to lose our control over them. And so it's not to pretend, like, no, words will never incite into action. No, it's fine. Go ahead and say you're politically revolutionary things, nothing will come of it. It's about respecting that power of words and saying, how do we harness it in a democratic society for our own benefit, and not allow a very few number of people, whether they be politicians or carping mainstream media journalists, have control over them. Words are powerful, that's why they must be free. That's the main point.
I'd just like to say something about anonymity. I think it's a tactical question. If you feel it's important, I don't mind. I'd rather you put your name to things, but I do think sometimes people misuse it, particularly academics. There are a lot of academics who love to be anonymous, they write anonymously, and it nauseates me because they're probably quite powerful. They can speak up, they're not going to be sent to the gulags, but they just don't do it. So I think we have the same for academic freedom. A lot of people say, can we sign it anonymously? Well, what's the point of that? You know, it's like, get it rid, the culture of fear. But academics are supposed to be the people who model free speech in society. And they're not doing it. And I think the biggest problem is not anonymity, it's just not speaking up on issues. I always say about Kathleen Scott and Sussex, if you know about the case, I'm sure. But what are the academics and students doing there? Nothing. Totally passive. Nobody said anything. And I would have said more about other cases that have been signed. The death of Samuel Paty in France. The Batley school teacher. Total silence from academics and others. That tells you there's a bigger problem than anonymity.
So just to pick up on the last person who asked, have our views changed over the last year about free speech? No, I've always felt that free speech is absolutely fundamental to democracy, because the whole point of democracy is that you hear ideas you don't like and you disagree with, and you challenge them, and then we all have the argument, and more or less, eventually, in the long term, we come out with better answers. And sometimes it's not the answer you wanted, and sometimes the democratic decision is not the decision that you wanted, but nevertheless we stumble on towards the light. And that's why I'm in favour of freedom of speech. And the reason I'm against banning online anonymity is because sometimes that gives us more freedom of speech. Sometimes in order to exercise freedom of speech, you need the freedom to be anonymous. And the idea that rights come with responsibilities, I think, always needs to be countered with the question, well, responsible to whom? Because in theory, at least, in a democracy, we are not responsible to the government for our thoughts and our words. Our elected government is responsible to us, and we should keep it that way.
We have a really massive round of applause for our panelists. Free speech is one of the 7 pillars that we've got as the Together Association. We're now an association, and we've got the Together Declaration is now hitting 150,000 public signatories, leaders, MPs and others signing it. We want to make it many more hundreds of thousands, so please tell your friends, share it. Also, we're going to be announcing something very exciting in the next few days, which is going to be nationwide. And we actually think that the only way you get change is if we can have these discussions out and open. And I think tonight's been a good opportunity to do that. And one of the things I'd like to sort of just take the spirit of is that we can believe that our ideas can be inflammatory, they can be dangerous, right? And that they can transform things, but we also have a responsibility to believe in one another, that we can actually do that, and we're big enough to hear them and make our own decisions. And if the idea is good enough, and if you think you're really right,
you've got a responsibility to convince people out there and not just lazily say they're stupid or they just belittle the narrative, whatever. We have a responsibility to go out and convince people of why, if we think we want to see things go back to how they were before, and we take that spirit. I'm going to ask, just before, and as I say, we're going to sort of do some informal stuff afterwards, but a couple of people to come and say a few words. Firstly, Campbell, you saw him earlier. Campbell's doing something called the Jam, which he'll tell you much more about, but across the UK and internationally. Very quickly, he's going to say a few words, and then Fiona after that.
Thanks, Alan. And yeah, give up one more time for the panel. And all the amazing independent journalists here today. We just distributed about Reading Machine on 11. I'm sure there's lots of fantastic people out here doing great projects in the support of freedom. Mark Choate at the back, I see you, brother. Alright, so yeah, my project's called Jam for Freedom. As you probably heard from my statement, I'm quite a bold man. You know, I believe you should.
Campaign is such a great thing as well because it really is unifying. It really is bringing together people that don't have such strong opinions as myself. I've got very strong opinions. And on the note of censorship, what Mark Francois was saying, I spoke to him on the way out, and he had some strong opinions about the reason to, you know, for censorship, essentially, and the anonymity online. Eliane spoke to you earlier on about being banned. I'm on my 7th 30-day ban on Facebook, simply for questioning the narrative, and that's the problem. There is no open debate. There is nothing there to say our side, our opinion gets heard at all. So when we go out and protest, we actually do influence public opinion. We are reaching people on the streets. Alan said himself as well that we saw people cheering and applauding as we were going by. And with Worldwide Demonstration, what we're doing is we're uniting the whole world. Anyone that goes to worldwide demonstrations, you are standing with millions and millions of people all across the world. It's very powerful. One day we all stand together. The next one is on the 22nd of January, 2022. People always say it's a little bit too long in between, but we do obviously hold other protests locally, regionally, and we've got 17 locations now across the UK. So we all need to keep protesting because you do influence public opinion and we are making our voices heard. And we need to keep protesting because we are now protesting for the right to protest.
And just finally, there are other great organisations that we're working with alongside Park Together, like a Stand in the Park, up and down the country, and we're asking everyone, if you're watching us on the live stream, we'd like you all to get involved locally. We're seeing great hubs that we're connecting with now, and we think that we can have a real influence with constituents on their MPs locally, and actually having our voices heard democratically and speaking to them civilly, but really critically, and holding their feet to the fire and saying, you know, we are going to hold you responsible from the point of view of our votes, depending on what you think on these things and what you do on these things. So are you going to, and one thing we know is that once they start hearing from more than a few of their constituents, they take that very seriously. And whatever your views are on vaccine mandates and vaccine passports, and we've seen what's happening all around Europe and internationally, one thing's for sure, if we don't have open, free debate and free speech, we're never going to be in a position to have those arguments and discussions and thrash them out. So long may free speech reign. Let's all encourage everyone to do it. Thanks again to the panellists, to Darren, Carter, James, for the right line. Please everyone come together at technology.org, and we'll see you very soon. Thank you very much.
Final point, good to see everybody here. We've got a limited edition T-shirt collection, Together T-shirts, and you can come and take one, but we'd really like a donation if you were able to do that. As you see, they're very, very visible. We got our first, somebody who was in Costa Rica today, who saw them online, they kind of promoting the Together Declaration. And yeah, come and see us, and thanks for coming everybody, it's great to see you. Continue the battle, and thanks very much.
Yeah. Yeah, what's up, mate? Was it? This seems like like 3 times. I was wearing the GoPro, like this is getting warm, do you want to feel? The GoPro will be alright, they don't, well, they do it. Yeah, they do. It feels like fucking summer again when my phone was overheating every time I went into a building. I went overheated when we fucking stopped I don't know what to do about it.
Can you buy a £700 phone? And they're like, oh, sorry, it's too hard when you
Alright, just stop filming, yeah? Alright, that's wonderful. Ah, you put it on the wrong way. See, this way, you can't open it.
It's alright. Do you know anything?
I know that.
I don't know anything about it.
Sorry guys, battery change.
No fucking camera will be it.
Neither do I. There you go.
Maybe they invited him, I don't know.
Possibly. There you go. Right.
Cheers. Well, I don't know, mate.
Well, it's nice being at something a bit more relaxed where I don't have to worry about carrying my bag.
I know, it's less likely to get robbed because everyone's already got loads of money. Is that what it is?
What's that?
So it's less likely to get robbed because everyone's already got loads of money.
Yeah, it's a bit of a poshy crowd in here. A few people at the protest, so
yeah.
Who do I want to interview? I want to interview Francis Horse.
If you're standing against Francois.
Yeah. Right, guys, I'll do the interview. I think I might record it because I'm not sure how long I'll be waiting around.
Is that your bit?
Thank you for joining us. Yes. All the best. Thanks for joining us, guys.
Hey guys, how are you? Alright, mate. Alright. Hello. Yeah. Lots of people here that I recognise.
Are we going to be in church? Well, I have to get off this system already linked.
No, but you can take a...
Yes, I will.
Most people come in into these circles and they just accept their claim. You can make your claim at the same time.
Yeah.
Can't you? That's what you need to do.
Oh, okay, right.
So is that something of interest?
One second, I've just...
I don't know what he's on about. Yeah, I got invited to this.
You got invited?
He's my +1.
Yeah?
Not the other way around, surprisingly.
I didn't get an email. He gets the email, I don't get the email.
I know. This thing isn't turning on, mate. Did you actually put a battery in there?
Well, if you like come to events like this, we'll put you in touch with some.
What else is there? What else is there?
Well, there's quite a few events around. You just missed another good one on Saturday, but there's a protest going at the same time. I think you're more keyed up. I think you're more keyed up for these protests, aren't you? Marches.
I'm personally all very strange.
I think this is the battery that's first.
Yeah, I'd rather be like rolling around in the dirt.
Yeah. Well, we've got to the point now where we think we've established our point of view. We know what the numbers are. Nothing else can be achieved by just continually marching without any direct action at the end of it.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, exactly.
And most of these marches, that's where they've been leading to. Basically, an endless.
Yeah. Well, nothing much has really changed between them, has it?
Saturday, because I was doing another event on Saturday.
Oh, Saturday.
Yeah.
Hello.
Do you want a wine?
Yeah, I love some wine, mate.
Chin chin.
What? Oh, cheers.